Welcome to the Inside Out Money Podcast.
Can't even recognize this place. Too many pieces of our past mistakes.
Hi, I'm Maggie, and I believe real change starts from the inside out. So let's work together to improve our money and our lives from the inside out. We will explore all things money and our relationship with it. Join me each week with a rotating set of co-hosts, friends, and interviews. Let's jump in.
This time, we going round and round and round and round and round.
Okay, hi, this is Maggie, and this is a solo episode. We are going to do another listener Q&A episode. I received a lot of questions that I couldn't cover on the first Q&A episode, which was 5 or 6 episodes back. I'll put a link in the show notes to it. And I got a lot of positive feedback from that. So every now and then I'll do some listener Q&A episodes, and we'll jump right in. If you are new here, hello and welcome to Inside Out Money. This is a personal finance podcast focused on redefining wealth from the inside out. Every week I speak with a rotating set of co-hosts about a different financial topic to help you improve your financial mindset and tactics. But like I said, today you've just got me, Maggie, and I'm going to start going through a ton of questions that I've received from you all via text messages, emails, and Instagram. Okay, we'll hit the first question. How to stay motivated while getting out of debt and being intentional with money/staying patient. Okay, I'm going to say this on every question. Every single one of these questions could be an entire dedicated episode, and I'm going to do my best to answer these, within a few minutes. I think there's a couple big things you can do to stay motivated while getting out of debt. One is track your net worth. So we talk about this. I'll put a link in the show notes to episodes and different templates that can help with tracking your net worth. But it is as simple as a simple Google sheet or Excel sheet where you list all of your assets and all of your liabilities and then add them up together to show your total net worth. If you're in debt, your total net worth is likely negative, and that is okay. The reason you're measuring your net worth is because you want to see it improving over time. And the idea is what gets measured gets improved. And so you need to be measuring where you're currently at in order to make improvements. So I think one of the biggest ways to stay motivated while getting out of debt is to track your net worth and then make a big chart and put, if you're trying to pay off $10,000 or $100,000 or more, make a visual way to keep track of it that's somewhere very prominent in your home. Maybe it's in your closet. Maybe it's on your bathroom mirror. Maybe it's up in your kitchen, somewhere that you see it every day. Maybe you want your kids and your partner and everybody to see it. It's not something you should be ashamed of. It's something that you should be focused on. And having a visual way to track and measure and keep that progress can be incredibly helpful and motivating. The other thing I like to try to do when trying to motivate really anything, but especially getting out of debt, and something where you kind of have to limit yourself in different ways and have some level of discipline, is to really focus on your mindset and think about your mindset around debt and money in general. And if you take more of a Buddhist approach to your finances and to life, it's reframing things to appreciate how much you have versus how little you have. So, it's the idea that, you can drive by a ton of houses in your neighborhood or another neighborhood that's nicer and think, oh, they have nicer houses than me, they have a nicer car than me, whatever it might be. And you're going to constantly feel bad about yourself if you're comparing yourself to people who have more than you. But there's likely so many people in this world that have less than you. And focusing more on that and focusing on the appreciation and that gratitude angle can really reshift your mindset around money and help you focus and stay motivated on getting out of debt. So focus on how much you already have. Focus on the fact that you have a roof over your head and food on the table. And don't focus on what you need to limit yourself on to get out of debt, right? Because reframing and shifting your thoughts to more of, an attitude of gratitude and to appreciating how much you already have versus others can really help you appreciate what you already have and then not focus so much on the things that you might need to limit in order to get out of debt. It'll make you appreciate what you already have and not feel like you need to constantly be spending more in order to be happy. And the more that you realize that happiness doesn't come from physical possessions and objects, the easier it will be to stay motivated getting out of debt. So to me, combining the idea of like tracking your net worth, having a big visual chart up of what some of your debt payoff goals are and tracking the progress against those And then also reframing your mindset around appreciation and how much you have versus others can really be some very powerful motivators to help you get out of debt and be much more intentional, and to kind of approach the second part of the question also. Okay, the next question is how to handle an unexpected large sum of money, for example, spouse life insurance. And then other people ask questions like what to do with a windfall, like a work bonus. So I think the answer to this depends on where you are with your finances. So you need to kind of think about an order of operations. So for example, do you have high interest debt you need to pay off? Do you already have an emergency fund? If you already have an emergency fund saved up, then you don't need to put the money towards that. If you already have all your debt paid off, you don't need to put the money towards that. That's when you want to start looking at how you want to invest that. And that's where I would encourage you to invest a good chunk of it, either all at once or dollar cost averaging it into the market in some larger chunks. But if you have high interest debt to pay off, if you're not already maxing out your 401k, you want to kind of, again, think about this order of operations, right? And to me, it's paying off high interest debt, probably everything but your mortgage. And if your mortgage is a high interest rate, then starting to attack that. Then it's, do you have an emergency fund? Then it's, are you maxing out your 401k? Are you putting money or maxing out an IRA after you max out the government's limit on your 401k? So I think the big things you want to think about are just sort of where you personally are at in your finances with that unexpected, large sum of money. Also, if you, like in the example of someone who said spouse's life insurance, which by the way is incredibly sad, and I'm very sorry, that is just I can't imagine, a very tough situation. On that one, you may have kids, you may not want to invest that in the market because that might be the money that you need to live off of in the short term, right? And so that's where, I'd immediately put that large sum of money into a high yield savings account while you figure out what you need to do. But so much of the question to what to do with an unexpected large sum of money or a windfall like a work bonus depends on the current state of your finances. But what I want people to think about is, given the current state of your finances, you really want to create a bit of an order of operations and thinking about, again, starting with the highest interest debt that you want to pay off, making sure that you're doing the big things like maxing out your 401k, that you've got a healthy emergency fund in place, et cetera. And then I would look to invest chunks of it or keep some of it for a short-term cost in a high yield savings account. That's what I would focus on. There's a million things you could do with it. You could invest in real estate property. You could look into CDs, treasury bonds, all sorts of things. But those are really the big things that I would be thinking about with it. We got a fun question where somebody was asking about how Andrew's vegan journey is going. So since this is a solo episode, Andrew was kind enough to record a quick voice snippet to let us know how it's going. Here it goes.
Thanks for asking about my vegan journey. 6 months in, and overall, I'd say it's going pretty well. I think my breakfast and lunch are definitely better than dinner. Breakfast has been pretty easy transition for me. Lunch, I mainly do lots of big salads, and then also I make chickpea salad. So I replaced tuna with chickpeas on my sourdough bread. And then dinner, I'd say dinner's where more of the challenge has been. I need to just work on my creativity for dinner. But lots of big rice bowls. Also do big salads. From a protein perspective, I eat lots of air-fried tofu, black beans, but definitely trying to add some more variety to my dinner is my goal over the next couple months. But yeah, I feel good, feel great, and I'm going to try and stick with it. I haven't gotten my blood work done yet. That's going to be kind of the big milestone to see where my cholesterol levels are and if I've been able to make a difference. But I'll probably get that work done maybe in September or October. So thanks.
Okay. Thanks, Andrew, for sharing. I think it's been a fun side effect of having the podcast that, the people you talk to on a frequent basis and surround yourself with can often influence things in your life. And Andrew and I had a number of conversations about plant-based, and he was kind of curious about it, and we talked more about it. And I think it's pretty cool that he's doing it and that he's like a really serious athlete. And there's a lot of really serious athletes that have gone plant-based and shown that you can have, the same, if not better performance from shifting to a vegan or plant-based diet. Okay, the next question was actually about influencer courses. So this was someone that I honestly lost the more detailed question because it was in a long Instagram thread, but there's a lot of influencer courses that are out there that are everything from something real estate related to to financial independence related. And my thing would be really cautious, because there are a lot of influencer courses out there that charge thousands of dollars and really, unfortunately are preying on people's desire to make improvements to their life and to be able to, find a solid source of income and other things like that. And, there's entire networks of like real estate courses and conferences where they're making their money off of the courses. There's not a lot of actual success cases coming out of those courses. So instead, they're taking thousands of dollars from people who can barely afford to give those thousands of dollars and who think they're going to, get rich off of real estate. And yes, you can certainly make money from real estate, but it is not easy. It requires a certain level of knowledge and interest and fortitude and many other things to get it right. And there's a lot of risk in real estate. And anyways, I think the thing on influencer courses is you want to be really cognizant of the cost versus the potential outcome and really trust your gut. Like, do a lot of research, talk to someone who's actually taken that course before if you can, read reviews and be very weary of reviews, because if they're reviews on their own website, they won't always be true, or they'll be filtered out to only the good ones. I would go Google the name of those courses, go to different FI groups on Facebook and ask if anyone else has done them before. And I just think, there are courses that are like thousands of dollars and there are courses that are like $100. And sometimes you could say you get what you pay for, but I know of some very good courses. Like Personal Finance Club puts out some courses that are between like $99 and $149. They're often on sale. They're teaching you about investment. They're teaching you about investing, and they do a really good job, and they're fantastic courses. I'll put a link in the show notes to them. But like courses like that, there's a lot of really great feedback and data on, and they're a very reasonable price point that, quite honestly, even if that course wasn't for you, you're out $100 and it's not a massive deal. The ones that really I don't love are the ones that are, thousands of dollars. And again, there might be some people, but I would argue it's a very small percentage that actually come out of that course with the ability to do something that they didn't already have the ability to do from reading a book, if that makes sense. And so to me, considering a course that costs thousands of dollars from an influencer, to be clear, an influencer who, like, I love, Liz Gets Loaded always says this, but like, if that influencer was making so much money from real estate, they wouldn't be selling a course, in my opinion. And again, I'm making that as a general statement because I just tend to think, if you're making so much money from real estate, why do you need to go and sell a course? And you could say like, yeah, people, they want to share their knowledge with others, but then you could share your knowledge at a very affordable price. You could write a book. You could do what Personal Finance Club does, which makes very affordable products. And so, it's a lot of work to put together a course and sell it. And if you truly just want to share your knowledge, you don't necessarily need to do that through a multi-$1,000 course, right? And so my advice to people on like these influencer courses is just keep your spidey sense up, as I like to say, right? Assume that it's not a great use of your money and then go try to prove yourself wrong. Don't just sign up for it. And I'm a big fan of continuing education from a trusted and reputable source, but there are so many courses out there that are just not a good use of your time or money. And they are really good at marketing and selling you on the potential. And again, there is potential for some people, but you can also get that same content, if it's truly good, through other very low cost or free resources like different books, podcasts, YouTube, etc. And I would really spend a lot of time there. And then if you really feel like you need some sort of a, in-person course or a more in-depth course, start to look at that. But I would exhaust all of my other resources first. And I would do a ton of research before I ever invested thousands of dollars in an influencer course. Okay, next question. Okay, I was debating even answering this question, but I get asked some version of this question all of the time. So the question is, do your exes have an opinion or comment about you and Greg being early retired? Does it play into things? So Greg and I have a blended family. Greg is my husband, and we met almost 10 years ago, over 10 years ago, actually. And I had one daughter and he had two daughters, and his two daughters were like 2 and 5 and my daughter was about 2. And so our kids have known each other since they were 2. They're now 12, 13, and 16. When we knew we wanted to early retire and we're really sure, like pretty sure we were going to do it, we told our exes about our plans about a year before we actually did it. And when we told them, our commitment to both of them is that we would keep child support the same. We were like, look, us leaving our jobs is not going to impact the current setups we already have with you. So in Greg's case, he pays child support and he wouldn't be asking to pay less or asking for an adjustment because he, quote, didn't have a job anymore. And I wouldn't be asking for more. I received child support from my ex and I wouldn't be asking for more. And so that was, kind of the big conversation we did have with our exes. And, otherwise I would say, we don't talk about it a lot. I think our exes appreciate that we are much more available and flexible to help with the kids, to drop something off at school that somebody forgot, to, greet them when they get off the bus after school and, drive them around a lot and stuff like that. And so that is, I think, something that, everybody benefits from and is a nice side effect of us being early retired and much more available. But on the sort of, views on money and things like that, every single family in the whole world handles money differently and has different approaches and mindset and different backgrounds to kind of how they think the way they do about money. But the one thing I've discovered about, kids, especially in like a blended family, is, they're very adaptable from house to house. I've learned that from talking to kids therapists, but also from my own personal experience. They're incredibly adaptable and they really can adjust on the different expectations and cultural norms and different things at each individual house that they spend time at. And so, what we do is we focus on our house and how we want to think about money and what we want to teach the kids about money. We don't focus on other people. And I say that, about our exes, but I also say that just in broadly about like, you do you, worry about yourself. You'll do a lot better in life in general if you focus on yourself and don't focus on other people. And so that's kind of, how we handle things. And, things are very amicable with both of our exes, but in general, I try to make it a habit to not talk about them or our setups or, specific details on this podcast because they didn't choose for their lives to be, publicly spoken about on a podcast the way that Greg and I have through our desire to be more transparent and vulnerable regarding personal finances. And so I really try to be very limited on, what we even talk about in that respect. But I get that question so much, and I felt like that wasn't violating too much privacy to share that bit of detail. So hope that is interesting to those who have asked. Okay, in addition to questions about our exes, we got some questions about Canadians. School's unexpectedly out today because of the hurricane that was headed up Florida and through Atlanta. So I've got some 12-year-olds at my house today, and they're gonna interject and help read some of the questions here and there also.
Any advice for Canadians who don't have quite the same levers as in the US?
Okay, I get a number of questions about Canadians. And first off, I'm not a Canadian. I don't live in Canada. I don't know the specifics. But I would say, the quote levers are simple and international in their approach, right? Spend less than you make, invest the difference. You can choose to invest in the US stock market if you're in Canada. I'm not an expert on this, but it is possible. I've looked into it a little bit. And so, I would say in general, don't assume that there's anything that's holding you back, right? I had access to a deferred compensation plan, but many people don't. It has some nice tax benefits. I'll actually speak to what DCP is a little bit later because I got a question on that. But it has some nice tax benefits, but it's by no means the only reason I was able to retire or the reason I was able to retire. I could have done it without that, and it would have had, a minimal impact on the overall situation. So the biggest things is I would say, find some Canadian financial fire people and follow them. I've seen a number of them on Instagram. There's, a number of podcasts and books and other things that are out there that are hosted and written by Canadians. So focus on that content to learn the things that you can do in your specific region and market. And, appreciate the things you do have. Like Canadians have way better access to health insurance, and they have a lot of other benefits and programs that I'm not even familiar with. Yes, there may be, the 401k structure, for example, is not the same. But I would just focus on what you do have available to you, which again, sorry, I am not an expert in. So find the people who are experts in it and engage and follow their content also. But really remember, we all have access to the same levers ultimately. Some of the specifics of them are different in terms of, very specific programs like how 401k works or if there's deferred compensation programs or other things like that. But ultimately, you want to focus on spending less than you make and saving and investing the difference. That's the, those are the magical things to get you to financial independence and or early retirement. Okay.
How do you determine your withdrawal strategy at retirement age?
Everyone's is going to be different depending on how you are funding your own specific retirement. And there are a lot of different free tools that can help you plan and forecast. You also might want to employ a financial coach or a fee-based planner to help on this if you feel like your situation requires that level of detail. But I think overall, you just want to make sure that you specifically have a plan for your own personal situation, and everybody's will be different. So again, mine is very focused on my deferred compensation plan and payments that I get every year, and then also dividends that pay out from my stock market holdings. And eventually I will sell off index funds as I need them. And then as I get even older, I'll tap into my 401k, IRA, and Social Security will kick in. And so I have a plan that is fairly loose for what it's worth, but that, I loosely know what my annual expenses are, and I loosely know what's going to fund those annual expenses during the next, 10 to 15 years, and then the next 10 years after that, and then the next 10 years after that, and so on. And so it really is going to be different for every single person. There's a lot of really cool planning and forecasting tools you can use. I'm going to put a bunch of links in the show notes to previous Friends on Fire episodes where we have talked about how we were able to afford to early retire and what our withdrawal strategy will look like, and some other things around the financial mechanics of early retirement. And so those are Friends on Fire podcasts, episode 138, episode 190. And then we also did an Inside Out Money podcast, episode 22, on how much do you need to retire and some flaws in the 4% rule. And then I'll also put a bunch of links to some different tools like the C-Fire Sim tool, the Early Retirement Now Withdrawal Rate Toolbox. There's a lot of free and or some that require a small fee, but the last two I just mentioned are free, and I'll put a link in the show notes to them. But there's a lot of cool tools out there that can help you plan your specific withdrawal strategy and figure out if you have, enough money overall to retire also. Okay.
Anything keeping you up at night regarding money or being early retired?
So honestly, not really. A lot of things are keeping me up at night lately, which is just that I'm getting older and my sleep is not as good as it used to be. But I think there were a lot of things keeping me up at night leading up to early retirement and in the earlier stages. But being 2 years in and seeing how I'm doing financially and kind of watching, I kind of knew how the math works, but watching it actually play out. If you spend, in general, on average, if you spend less than 4%, right, you're continuing to make money and you're not spending into your nest egg. And that's where we currently are at. And so, it is nice to be in a position where, we're seeing how the finances of early retirement actually start to play out. And again, we're still early in, we're only 2 years in. But yeah, no, not a lot is keeping me up at night. I feel pretty good about things. I do expect there to be some big drop in the market at some point. I don't know if it's months away or years away, but I'm not expecting it's always going to be as plentiful and profitable as it has been in the last few years. And I'm, mentally prepared for that. So it really doesn't keep me up at night because I'm expecting it. What goes up will come down at times and it'll go back up long term. So I'm okay with that. I sometimes think about the example I'm setting for my kids, and how that will impact their own drive and work ethic. And, so I think about stuff like that, but really nothing's keeping me up at night. I think about a lot of stuff, but it doesn't keep me awake. Okay, the next question is
tips and tricks for using Monarch Money.
Okay, so as we've talked about in a number of podcast episodes, Greg and I switched when Mint retired to Monarch Money. We're big fans of it. We really like it. I'll put a link in the show notes to a whole episode where we talked about it. And all of the other Inside Out Money co-hosts have also coincidentally shifted to Monarch Money and are enjoying it. So I'm not going to answer this on a podcast because it's a hard one to talk about, but Greg did do a full presentation on this at a recent Camp Fi, and it's actually on YouTube. So I will put a link in the show notes to Greg's YouTube presentation on Monarch Money. Go check that out. It is on Camp Fi's YouTube channel. Okay.
Spending savings on kid clothing or kid activities.
First off, with kids' activities, there's a ton of free stuff that you can do with kids. So I would focus on that, especially when your kids are younger and they don't kind of care as much and have a say in what they're doing, because when they get older, it's a lot tougher to control where they want to go and what they want to do with their friends. And, as they get older, we often require our kids to use their own money when they do go off and do activities with their friends. We also give them opportunities to earn money to do those things. But I just think there's so many things. I was just talking to somebody about this at a Choose 5 meetup group. When your kids are younger, it's so much easier to control their everything, right? Their clothing, their activities, their gifts. They don't have a vocal opinion or as much of a vocal opinion on many of these things. And so it's a lot easier for them to be fine with hand-me-downs and used clothes and things like that. But then as they get older, they have a lot more, especially into teenage years, and we have girls in particular, and they have a lot more requests and influences of, the things they want and the brands they want, the stuff they want to wear. And, we're still, thoughtful and intentional and minimal to some extent with what we will buy for our kids. But It's just a lot harder as they get older. And it's definitely, it's like you're not spending money on daycare anymore, but as they're getting into their teenage years, you're definitely spending money on sports and a lot of other things that can get pretty expensive. But my biggest thing on clothing is just focus on hand-me-downs, focus on used stuff, and then minimize the volume. Most kids kids of all ages have way more clothes than they actually need and can use, and it can become, very overwhelming to take care of, especially when they're still growing. Okay, I loved this question. Explain deferred compensation to a fifth grader. So it's funny, I have my own explanation on this, and then I also went to AI to literally ask them to explain it to a fifth grader. And they gave me a funny reply. So I'll share that one at the end. Here's my attempt to explain deferred compensation to a fifth grader. So some companies, small and large, just depends on whether they want to offer this as a benefit or not, offer what is called a deferred compensation plan. I often refer to it as a DCP. Some nonprofits have a version of that, and teachers and other things, that it's actually called a 457B. It's a very similar program. And the basics of how deferred compensation works is you are allowed to defer some percentage or amount of your compensation and say, I don't want to receive it now, but I want to receive it at a later date. And so the idea is you're deferring that compensation until a later date. Often that's retirement. In my case, that's early retirement. So the idea is you're doing this for tax optimization purposes and for like forced savings purposes, you could say. So to take a really simple example, let's say I made $100,000. I could choose to defer 50% of my salary and say, take 50% of my money. Don't ever pay it to me. I won't pay taxes on it. And I'll pay taxes on it when I receive it later and I'm in a lower tax bracket, right? That's the theory, is that you'd be in a lower tax bracket at some later point in your life. And so, I deferred money when I was working that would have been taxed at 30+%. And now it's getting taxed at, under 20% or under 22%. And so the idea is you are able to defer money. It then sits in an account, an investment account. You get to choose what investments it sits in, just like you get to choose what investments your 401k sits in. You choose whatever's available in that program. And then when you take that money out is when you pay taxes on it as if it was income then. So the trick on DCPs and 457Bs is they're all structured differently based on, there's some like IRS rules around them. And then there's a lot of different rules of how different companies structure the plans. And the different rules limit like how and when you can access that money. And so it is hard to get into the specifics of that because it's very different and unique at every company and complicated. And my company's plan, I always thought was very complicated. And it's one of the reasons I didn't participate in it at first. Most people don't even understand what they are. And then the rules on kind of like when you access the money. But the main idea is each year, during annual benefit enrollment, I had to decide how much to put into deferred compensation for that year, and I couldn't change it throughout the year. So some years I'd put in 2% because the company matched 2% at my level, and some years I'd put in 75% towards the end. And that amount of money, when I'm choosing to put it in, I had to choose from a number of options how it would be paid out to me. And I had to choose it then. It was either a lump sum when I left the company. When I left the company, 10 lump sums over the next 10 years after I left, or 5 lump sums 5 years after I left. Those were like the general options. And the idea is the reason you would want to do those 5 or 10 lump sums spaced in the 5 to 10 years after you leave is that you're trying to optimize for taxes. So you don't want to receive a big lump sum because a big chunk of it's going to be taxed at a really high percentage rate. And so all of this is around tax optimization and being able to also save and invest, while that money is growing. But I have all of these different, over 10 years when I was participating in a DCP, I had all these different selections I had made. Sometimes I knew what I was doing. Sometimes I didn't know what I was doing. And so I've got a hodgepodge of a DCP program, but I've got all this money sitting in my deferred compensation account at a brokerage firm that my company manages essentially. And every year this is the way mine works. They're all different. On the 1-year anniversary of me leaving, I get a payout of a certain percentage of that money basically. And it has to do with when I put the money in. And again, it's too complicated to explain here. And it's too unique to my situation for it to matter to anyone else. But that's kind of how it works. Here's how AI described it. It's like saving some of your candy or money, but candy in a jar for a future date, letting it grow, and then enjoying it later when you might need it more. So I thought that was a nice way to explain it to a fifth graders. If, we put all of our candy in a jar now and decided to save some for later. I've also described it as like a 401k for before retirement. So it doesn't have the the same tax benefits of a 401k, but it does have the ability to defer some of your compensation to a future date when your taxes might be lower. Now, you just don't always know if they will be lower. If I went back and got a job 2 years from now and had a really high income, that DCP payment's going to be taxed the same way it would have been taxed, 10 years ago. But either way, it's been sitting there and growing in the market in investments that I get to choose. And so I like it because it's a nice deferral strategy for some taxes, but it's also a kind of forced savings, right? So I can't access that money without penalty. I don't think I can access it at all, actually. Like, you can access your 401k with penalty. You can't access the DCP at all, except for on the timeline that it's currently on. So, I mean, it is a nice kind of forced savings and income stream that I really enjoy and was appreciative to have it available to me, and then also kind of understand how it worked. Because again, I didn't understand how it worked for a very long time. And so I was underutilizing it. And then the last, I'd say 4 or 5 years of working, I was heavily utilizing it. And for a couple years, I did 75%. I deferred 75% of my salary to kind of practice early retirement, but to force some really aggressive savings also. And that has paid off because that is helping to pay for my life over the next 10 years. Okay, there are again more questions than I'm ever going to get to in one episode. So there'll definitely be more Q&A episodes, but I am going to do some speed rounds. So a lot of the questions are answered in detail from some past episodes. So I'm going to do some just general like quickies and speed rounds now.
What day do you track your net worth and why? I always track on the last day of the month.
I personally always track mine on the first day of the month, but it doesn't matter. Just pick any day and be consistent so that it's a more useful metric. Because if you pick like a different day every month, it's just kind of wonky in terms of it being like interesting, comparable data, I think. And it makes me feel better to have a consistent day. So I always do the first of the month because it's just a nice, easy number to remember and a good way to start my month off. If you like doing it on the last day of the month, that's great. If you're going to do it every 2 months, pick the same day you do it every 2 months. If you do it once a quarter, always do it on, the first at the beginning of the quarter or whatever it might be. Also, an inconsistent approach is better than nothing. So do not let perfect be the enemy of good. Just do it whenever you think about it. The more data you have, the better. I've only consistently tracked my net worth for a few, maybe 6 or 7 years now. And prior to that, I had inconsistently done it every now and then. And it's even interesting to go back and look at those random times when I did track it, just to look at the growth over time. So I would suggest anything is better than worrying too much about the details. Okay, next question was
replenishing your emergency fund after using it for an emergency, e.g. vet emergencies.
To me, is the exact same thing you did to build it up in the first place, likely, right? Set a goal, tighten up if you need to on your budget, sock away all the extra cash you can as much as and often as you can. But likely it's the exact same activities you needed to do to build up that emergency fund in the first place. Okay, all of the next ones of these are questions I got that are answered in other podcast episodes we've already done. So I'm really just going to reference podcasts and then put links in the show notes. Someone said, would love to hear more about your rental properties, tips, tricks, best advice, etc. So we have 2 rental property episodes. One is Friends on Fire, episode 66, which is how rental properties can grow your wealth or cause headaches. And then we did an Inside Out Money episode, number 19, where Greg and I talked about how and why we self-manage our rental properties. And we shared a lot of our tips and tricks and best advice there. So I would suggest you go listen to those 2 podcast episodes, and I'll put links in the show notes. Next question was about estate planning, will or real estate planning for people who are young and don't think they need it. So I would say everybody needs it because it doesn't matter how old you are. We all could suddenly have something terrible happen tomorrow in terms of getting sick or dying or getting hit by a car or anything. So everybody needs a solid estate plan and, the right medical power of attorneys in place and wills and things like that. So we did an episode on Friends on Fire, episode number 40 with estate planning with Elaine Levine. I would recommend you go back and listen to that episode. And there's a lot of great resources just in general out there about things that are helpful. There's a ton you can do online yourself, but I would encourage you to spend the money to hire an attorney to really get them done properly and right for you, because I think those documents can save other people a lot of headache if you get things taken care of properly. Okay, making sure you're not passing on a money mess in your passing. That's similar to like the estate planning, right? So if you document things well and tell people where those documents are, and you have a solid estate plan and you've got a will in place and you've got, all those documents in place, you're likely in a really good spot for not passing along a mess. There's also a website I always really liked that is called getyourshittogether.org. And I think it was written by somebody whose spouse suddenly died and she realized she didn't know where anything was, like passwords, which bank accounts, like where their money was, like she didn't know where anything was. So she has some like different guides and checklists on that website. I would recommend checking out something like that. But I think in general, get your stuff organized, right? Like to quote that website's name, get your shit together, and then you won't be passing on a money mess in your passing. So that's the quick answer. Another question, how many credit cards are too many? I have 7 and I pay them off fully each month. Okay. So we've done a ton of episodes on travel hacking and credit cards and what's in our wallet. Andrew and I did episode 39 on what's in our wallet and shared each of the credit cards that we each hold. I use about 4 different credit cards. I have like a Delta SkyMiles Amex. I've got an Amazon Visa. I have a Target debit card, I guess, because I like the 5% back at Target. And I have like 2 other cards for various, like we have a business credit card and I can't even think of what my other credit card is, but I pretty much use that Amex Delta and my Amazon Visa. Those are my 2 primary ones. And I've gone in and out of like travel hacking. I did some aggressive travel hacking. Mike and I recorded a bunch of travel hacking episodes with Friends on Fire. Episode 83, 134, and 152 are all about different travel hacking and some like, we interviewed Julia from GeoBreeze Travel. We talked about a challenge we did to earn 1 million points in 2022. And we got like a bunch of credit cards that year. So I've done some travel hacking and then I canceled the cards after a year and before the next fee renews. But I've lately been off of the whole travel hacking thing. So Greg and I actually did an Inside Out Money episode number 13 on why we were quitting or really just slowing our travel hacking. And so I think the question of how many credit cards is too many is a personal question, right? Of if you are using them and you have them for different reasons, like I have my Amazon one because I really like the benefit I get when I shop on Amazon, which I do a decent amount. And I fly Delta a lot, so I like my Delta one, right? And so if you have a reason for having them and you're paying them off monthly, I think it's when you have too many and you're like losing track of them and you're not always paying off the bill and you forget to because you've got too many, that it just gets a little cumbersome. And so I personally, as I get older and older, just want to simplify more and more. But I would go check out some of those episodes if you are interested in hearing more about, why there would be a benefit to having multiple credit cards. But when I have had more credit cards, I don't hold them long term. I'm only doing it to get a sign up bonus and then I'm, not keeping that card most of the time. Okay, last question we're going to cover today. What actionable steps did you take to become financially free? At a very high level, we spent less than we made and we invested the difference. We also paid off our mortgage at one point, and we talk about this in a number of different episodes, but probably the most helpful one is we talk about it in Friends on Fire podcast episode number 138 of how a family of 5 can afford to retire at 41 and 43. It was a series of podcasts we did right around the time we announced that we were going to be early retiring together. I know this said actionable steps. At a high level, that's really, we tracked our net worth. We started tracking our expenses. We just started getting we had a lot of data and we started getting very aware of how much it costs us to live. And we pulled back on that for a while. We've kind of loosened the purse strings on that now, if you will. But we ultimately just spent less than we made and we're very careful and thoughtful and intentional with our money. And we aggressively paid off all of our debt when we were younger. And we also had pretty well-paying jobs and, that we both worked hard for, but we're very, privileged and fortunate to have. Okay. Well, we still have enough questions to do a whole nother Q&A. We'll keep doing these maybe every month or two. I really appreciate you all listening. If you want to take a moment to leave us a review, I really, really, really appreciate when anyone leaves us a positive written review on Apple Podcast or a rating on Spotify. If you've enjoyed this episode or if something's ever been helpful to you from this podcast, I really appreciate it if you don't mind taking a moment to go leave us that written review on Apple Podcast. I really appreciate it. All of the co-hosts really really appreciate it also. We also encourage you to share this episode with a friend or family member to encourage ongoing discussions about money. You can always subscribe wherever you listen to podcasts. And if you have any thoughts or questions, we would love to hear from you. And you can leave us a voicemail or text us at 404-981-3370, or you can hit us up on Instagram. And as you can tell from this episode, if you leave us a question or a voicemail or send us a message on Instagram, we will eventually answer your question directly, or we'll put it in an episode like this and answer it. So thank you so much, and you guys have an awesome day. Bye. Oh, and in case you're curious, this is what it sounds like when I try to get Kate and some of her friends to record questions for me. Lots of giggling.
Me.
Now you want to wait, Kate.
Shut up.
I'm going to use that. How do you determine you're going to read that one now? You can put your face about there and read the how do you do job. Okay, wait, next question. Okay, this one, anything keeping you up at night? Okay. Read this one. What? Oh, wait, hold on.
Kate, you're reading this.
What do you do when y'all...
Let me do it.
What do y'all... Wait, which one?
You gotta put your face about right
Which
here.
one?
That one. What do y'all do when...
Wait, no, that was my teeth. Hold on.
I don't know if that's good for you.
Second one.
She does it all the time, and then
I
her
don't
dad
think
yells
it's good
at
for
her.
you. Okay, now do this one that says tips and tricks for using Monarch.
I made this thing.
I want to. No, it's my turn.
Oh, yeah, it is your turn.
Wait, which one do I do? Which one do I say? Wait,
What day do you track it?
No, wait, let me
Net
do it.
worth. It's supposed to say net worth, sorry.
Oh.
No, it's spelled wrong, you're right. Okay.
Sorry.
Nice. Okay, you can't open that in the background. It picks up like all the noise.
Yeah, so close it.
Okay. Okay, actually that's good for now, I think.
We're going round and round.